Hey there, friend, it's Cynthia, and welcome to my Quilt Lab. I'm glad you've joined me today because it is month 8 of this beautiful block of the month called Solare by Northcott Banyan Batiks, made by Be Quilting. We are in month 8. It's a big month. Let's jump in and get going. All right, if you've joined me in previous months, you'll notice that this block looks rather familiar. That's right, it's the King's Crown number 3 this time. We're making 12 of these blocks, so we're filling in some of these spots all the way around kind of center ring of the quilt. Speaking about the quilt, check in my description below for links with Bound to Be Quilting, Banyan Batiks, and where I work, Adirondack Quilts at South Glens Falls, New York, for all some good information. And I'll put a bunch of links below of products that I'm using that you're going to see throughout this video. Let's dig in and talk about the different fabrics that we're using today. Okay, so all of the fabric cutting instructions this time around is pretty straightforward, but I'll talk about them as I go. We're going to be using fabric 2. That's this beautiful dark one. You can see that's a big long strip of 2 5/8, I believe. We're making a bunch of these, so just make strips of 2 5/8 and then subcut to what the desired length is. Fabric 3 is this pretty one right here. It's 7 squares, which we're going to be cutting in half because you're going to see that we're going to use half in each square. So that's why there's 6 squares, because we're making 12 blocks. Yay, quilt math. Moving on to fabric number 11. That's that pretty teal. It's got a lot of variations. Sometimes it's greenish and sometimes it's purplish. It's beautiful either way, and it's a bunch of 2 1/4 inch squares. So make your 2 1/4 quarter strip, and then subdivide until you get the right amount that you'll need, 24 of those. Moving on to fabric 13, that's this lovely kind of multicolored burgundy. It has a lot of variation in it too, lots of different colors. You'll see that there's 2 lengths. They're both the same width, but there's 2 lengths. So what I did is I cut the strips of 2 3/8, that's the width, and then I first started with that longer piece, the 7 5/8, and cut as many of those I need, 12, and then moved on to the small ones. Had a lot of extra fabric here too, so that's always good to know. And then last, but certainly not least, is fabric 16. You'll see in the instructions again, there are 3 different sizes. There's a 2 3/4, a 2 5/8, and a 2 1/4. So I made 1 strip first with the 2 3/4. I cut that down as many times as I possibly could, and then switched off and switched off. I always cut the biggest one first. That way, if I make a mistake, I can just turn it into a smaller square if needed. Please remember to keep these all separated or identify them with a post-it note or a pen or something, because each square is used in a different place in the final finish, and I don't want you to get them mixed up because it's important that you're using the right size at the right time. All right, let's dig into this and talk about putting this block together. Okay, so I've made a version of this block earlier, as I mentioned, in month number 3. That was the first one. The second King's Crow I didn't do a video on because I had a secondary. But if you want to go back to month 3 and take a look at that one too for some extra information, now that I've done this block a whole lot, I do have a couple extra tips that I want to share with you. So let's dig in and talk about a little bit extra cutting. Like I said at the beginning, we're going to be cutting that big 7-inch square in half. We're also going to be cutting the 2 3/4 inch squares of that last fabric. Let me move these out of the way, in half, as well as the 2 5/8, because they're going to be used in different places where you see these half triangles. So let me just do that really quickly. Again, remember to keep these separated because you will use each piece at a different moment. Speaking about those pieces, let's jump in and we're going to first talk about these 2 outer little rows, these corner. So grab your pretty burgundy, and we're going to use that big one for those. So let's talk about this. All right, you'll see in the instructions that step 1 and 2, it looks kind of like this. Well, you'll see that the angles of each triangle is going in a different direction. You want to make sure that you're paying attention because that's important when it comes to that final block, that you don't accidentally switch them the wrong way. So always refer back to your pages before you start stitching. I do want to share a little tip with this guy right here. I actually did a scant 1/4 of an inch on this guy when I took it to the sewing machine, and that's because you'll see it's the long piece and it's really got to make up and be that whole length. I just found the scant 1/4 of an inch worked better than just your normal 1/4 of an inch, so I just want to throw that out. So we're going to take that to the machine, and I'm going to do a scant 1/4 of an inch on this one. Let me throw a pin in, and down here I'm just going to do my regular 1/4 of an inch right here. Please remember that anytime you cut these fabrics in half, any of these bias cut ones, it is a bias, so that stretches. So if you don't feel comfortable sewing bias, go ahead and give that a press with some starch or some best press. That will help in keeping it from pulling. If you have a walking foot on your machine, go ahead and break that out because that'll help keep the fabric moving evenly both on the top and the bottom. I'm going to take these to the machine and then we're going to be right back. All right, there's 2 pieces. There they are, pretty. Now I pressed towards that darker fabric, and I did that with all of my blocks. There's the back side. But you know what, guys? It's not going to matter, I think, for which way you do it, because you'll notice that these seams, they don't match up with anything. So feel free to press them whichever direction you feel most comfortable with, even if it's at pressing it open. The instructions don't say one way or the other. I just want you to be comfortable doing what you need to do. Let's move on to the next unit. So grab those teal pieces and the other beige square and triangles. All right, so there's the 2 pretty teal ones. There's that small beige one. And of the 4 half triangles from the 2 5/8, we're only going to be using 3. So you're going to save this other piece for another square. So don't throw this away or put it in your scrap pile. You will need it, I promise you. You'll see that the future will look a little something like this, with those pieces coming in there on the side. But let's talk about this middle piece first. All right, so we're going to be making rows here. So the first 3 pieces of rows, and the second row is just the 2, and the last row is just 1. So we're going to stitch all of these together, and I'm going to actually press towards the dark side each and every time. So these 2 seams will go in, and this seam will go towards the left. And you can see here on the back that that's what I did. It's going towards it's on that dark side, because this is going to nest up right there. It's not so much right here that's an issue. So you could go in the direction, all in the one direction if you wanted to, but you want to make sure that this nests up right there. Again, please do what you feel comfortable when it comes to pressing. I'm just trying to throw out a few suggestions and showing you what I'm doing. I've done these a few different ways now since we've had this block 3 times, and sometimes I change my mind, so it's all good. You can too. Let's take this to the sewing machine, and I'll take a few pictures as I go, and I'll meet you at the other end. Let's get stitching. All right, so the 2 rows are together. Let's just chat about this. I'm going to turn them over so you can see that they're going towards those greens. And like I said, the reason we do this is because we want this seam right here to nest. So what you do is you line them up, and they'll kind of butt up next to each other. But you can see they line right up. Grab a pin, and I like to put a pin right through that thread where that stitch is, and hopefully I come out the same on the other side. Oh, I'm just off just a smidgen. Third time's a charm. There we go. And because I have it right on that stitch, that means it'll be a perfect nest when I go to take this to machine. You want to throw a couple extra pins in to keep everything steady. And when I go to the machine, I always like to use the easiest side, which in this case will probably be this side when I take it to the stitch. That way I can watch and make sure everything is laying down properly. All right, let me take this machine. I'll be right back. All right, there we go. First 2 rows together. I just pressed down. Again, it doesn't really matter right here because that's where it'll bump up to, is right there. And look at that pretty line. Isn't that nice? That's what a nice 1/4 of an inch will do. So if you haven't practiced your 1/4 of an inch in a while, go ahead and give that a try so you get pretty piecing. All we got to do is add this last triangle, so that's what I'm doing right now. Just add a pin to take it to the machine, do that last stitch, and then we'll have this middle unit finished. All right, so there's that middle triangle unit all finished. So now we get to add these 2 pieces. The first thing we'll do is we'll add this top one. This is step 5 now, if you're following along in the instructions. Place that right on top, and yes, we are supposed to have that little kind of dog ear sticking out that side. That's a good sign. Let's do this piece. Let's take it to the machine and I'll be right back. All right, so there's that first burgundy. I pressed up towards that burgundy only because it's fewer folded areas that need to be folded again. There is a little bit of bulk right here, so if you wanted to open up this seam and press it that way, not a bad idea either. So one last step is this one, and this is why I like to give this a little scant. I would rather be just a little bit bigger, and when I say just a little bit, I mean just a hair bigger on this side, because we will be trimming these down just a smidgen, and it's easier to trim down than trim out. In fact, I have yet to figure out how I can trim bigger. I can only trim smaller. So we're going to take this one to the machine as well. I'm going to throw a couple of pins in. I'm going to also press towards that burgundy because once again it's going to be fewer folds and fewer stitch lines that I'll have to try to press in half, and I will see you in just a second. All right, there we go. There's that half of the block. Let me talk about something that is not mentioned in the instructions, but it's something that I do like to, that I figured out that I like doing with these blocks, and that is doing just a preliminary, it's not squaring because it's a triangle, but you understand. So I want to take off all of these little dog ears, and it's just going to nicely make a nice straight line. But before I do that, I want to talk to you about them first. Let me grab my handy dandy pointer. So all of these points across the long side right here, this should all measure 1/4 of an inch to the edge of that fabric, because we're getting ready to put this blue strip of fabric up next to it. And if we have this a nice 1/4 of an inch, it's going to be easier when we take this to the sewing machine. And I did this with every single block. So this is what I did. I can't quite line each point up with the 1/4 of an inch on the ruler. I'll use my pointer, but I'm doing my best in eyeballing it. I can get this one, I can get this one, and I'm just trying to make sure it all looks nice. You can actually use your mat too. So you can see on camera that there's just a little bit of a curve. And remember, that's because this is all bias. This is all bias, the triangles, because we cut those squares in half. So if you feel like you need to give it another best press or starch it, to help minimize the waviness, now's the time. And so I'm just looking to see if my little points are hitting 1/4 of an inch. If you need to get a piece of tape out and put it on your ruler, go ahead and do that too. I'm going to call that good. I'm going to hold my hand down on it as tightly as possible, and I'm going to just swipe across. And you'll see some of it took it off and some of it didn't, but that's okay because as long as it's a nice straight edge, which it is now, isn't that happy? We know that this is going to be easier to stitch up. All right, so next tip. This is going to get added to that, right? And we want to eyeball that. We want to eyeball that halfway mark into the halfway mark here. So if you give this just a little finger press here, it'll give it just a little bit of a crease. And I know you probably can't see that on camera very well, so I'll just throw a pin in where my little finger press is so that you can see that that's the middle of that. You can also measure it too if you want to, you know, 7.5 right there. And it's the same thing with this. This is the halfway mark. And instead of folding that in half, I'm actually just gonna line that up on a line, and I'm going to use my ruler, and I'm gonna make sure I'm hitting these halfway marks right here. Let me get my pointer out. Right here, here, and here. So those are all halfway marks. Make sure you can see that on camera. Let me bring it up. There we go. So right there, and the corner in the bottom. And I'm not going to fold it in half. I'm actually just going to take another pin and put it right there to mark that that's the halfway. There we go. So now we know, and I'll turn this over so that you can see, there's the same amount of extra fabric on each end. So take this to the sewing machine, sew with the piece part on top. That way you can hit those 1/4 inches. And if you can't see the 1/4 inch because it's folded over, so this is what I do. I like to make sure, okay, so it's right there. And I actually use a pin. I'm not going to sew over the pin. I'm simply using it as sort of an aiming device for the two points that I can't see because it's folded over right there. That way I know when I go to stitch it, I can really hit it and make sure everything's going to be nice and flat. So stitch down this way, hit that one, hit that one, and that bottom one there, and go all the way to the bottom. All right, be back in just a moment. Okay, we're getting so close to finishing this up. This is where we're at. So we are at, let's see, step number 7. We're in the middle of step number 7. Now, here's where the directions and I take a different avenue. I take it in a different way. And the directions will tell you that it wants you to trim off these corners right here to make that 9.5 inch square block. And if you have a ruler, I don't have a 9.5, I have a 10.5, so I'll just use my 9s as point. It wants you to line up at those edges and swipe right away. Now, respect to the people who wrote this, I think it's great directions, but I'm actually, because I know I left some it's a little off down here, I'm going to actually add this triangle piece first before I do any trimming down. I want to do trimming down at the end, and that's just a personal preference. Please feel free to follow the instructions. It's just, that's the 9.5, and you trim, and it should make lining this guy up really easily. But let me show you what I was doing, just so you have another option. So this needs to line up in the middle and here, and I'm not going to fold it. I'm actually going to do something a little sneaky. I'm going to line it up here on top. I'm going to eyeball it as best as I can, and then I'm going to grab my ruler, and I'm going to measure to make sure it's the same distance from right here to right here. So if I take my ruler and I put the inch right there, I can see that I'm hitting the 1/4 right here, and I'm hitting, about 3/16. So I need to move it to the right. I know, it's just a itty bitty little move. You barely saw that, right? And in the end, it probably wouldn't have mattered, but I know that that's nice and centered too. You also could have done that pressing in half and do a little finger press as well. whatever floats your boat. But I like doing it this way, and then I like to square up at the very end. It's just another option if you want to try something a little bit different. And after doing about, you know, a dozen or more of these blocks, it's just what I've gotten comfortable doing, and I wanted to share that with you. So let me take this to the machine and I'll stitch this across, and then we'll come back and I'll talk to you about how to square this down the way I did it. I'll be right back. All right, so I pressed this just out and away towards that block, and let's talk about squaring it up. So this block should be 9.5 inches square. Okay, so I don't have a 9.5 inch square ruler. I have a 10.5, so I'm using this tape. The tape's just there for me to quickly find that 9.5 inch mark. And what I'm gonna do is, so here's my starter. I have a lovely diagonal across here. I'll put it right there. I'm going to use that diagonal on this ruler to line up with this diagonal on the block, because that's the center of the block. And if you look at the picture, that's where the crisp cut needs to be, right on that line. So I'm taking this ruler, I'm setting that line right on top of that blue diagonal. And now I take a look and see where I'm lining up, okay? So I'm looking at the ruler and I'm seeing down here at the bottom, I have an inch, I have an 1 7/8. And I'm just looking at this triangle right down here in the bottom. I'll bring another one so you can see. I'm looking at this triangle, how much ruler I've got. 1 7/8. If I look over here, I have 1, 2 1/4. So I need to move it down a little bit. So if I move it down a little bit, making sure that I'm staying on that diagonal, I'm at 2 inches right here, which looks good. And I'm at 1, 2 inches, and about 2 5/8. So I'm going to scooch it down just a smidgen more. And that evens it out. Basically, I want this length and this length to be the same. I'm keeping that diagonal on the ruler, and then I'm looking at these just to make sure I'm getting the right amount. I'm cutting the right amount off, and I'm not going to make it lopsided one way or the other. Once I like the way everything looks, I'm just going to give it one last look. Looks pretty good, looks pretty good. And put my hand down, and I can cut this side, the right side, and the bottom. If you have a rotating mat, now's the time to break it out, because that would be super handy. And those two sides are perfect. So I'm going to put them over here so I can do, I've turned it, I've rotated it 45 degrees, so now I can do the top and the side. Now I can break out my square ruler here, or you can just use your mat. And I know what you're thinking, she's using rulers and mats. Guys, I think it's all fine. I like using all the tools I have available. And I'm just measuring out 9.5 inches. That's where I need to be, and making sure the fabric is nicely placed on the mat underneath, and I'll give this a swipe. And the same thing with that fourth side. Right on top of this. There we go. All right, there we go. That is the King's Crown, I should say, number 3. You have 11 more to make. I know, it's a big month, isn't it? The good thing is that you've done this block a couple of times, so hopefully it feels like a best friend, an old friend, right? And I'll see you next month for month number 9. We are almost at the end of the year. I'm so excited. Hey, if you've been enjoying these videos, please give me a like down at the bottom, or subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And be sure to check out all those links for all the products that I'm using, all that fun stuff. And if you have any questions, I love to answer them. Put that in the comments below, and I'll see you next month. Keep quilting.